They gave me 1 hour to pack. Those were the exact words Roger slid across the table as if the deadline was a favor, and the man it applied to a pile of miscellaneous goods. He set a manila envelope down with the kind of theatricality only an eldest son raised on boardroom PowerPoints and worse lunches could achieve. The watch on my wrist, my father's old Waltham, one of the few things that still kept the time the way I like it, ticked loud enough in that room to be its own punctuation. Outside, somebody was slicing into the roast I had been saving for Sunday. The lace tablecloth my wife used to iron by the window lay half crumpled under the envelope. A quiet accusation. They thought they were ending my story. You learn at 74 a useful skill, to look smaller than you are. It gets you further in airports, in hospitals, and apparently in family rooms when 4 sons decide legacy is a matter of expedience. So I sat and let them do the grandstanding. Roger talked about quality of life and liability like he was reading from a brochure. Claude tried to hold everyone at bay with that peacekeeping voice he'd inherited from a mother who knocked heads until they started to agree. Marcus III was fidgeting with a gold lighter he never earned. Junior smirked as if he'd just scored a role in some private comedy. They called Dr. Claudia, who wore responsibility like a badge, bright, clinical, and about as warm as a fluorescent light. You keep a leather purse in the back of a bureau when you have run a trucking company for 50 years. Not because you are sentimental, though I am that as much as anyone, because you learn to carry what matters with you. I opened it on the couch with them watching as if it were a Bible or a bad joke. Inside, a rosary with a chip in the cross, a folded list of preferred mechanics, a small leather folder with the kind of paperwork young men in suits don't read unless it benefits them, and a pair of glasses I only wore to read the fine print. They expected a helpless old man gathering slippers and an afternoon of soft daytime television. What they did not expect was the way hands remember the weight of things. The leather folder had weight. It was the sort of weight that had nothing to do with paper and everything to do with leverage. Wills, clear and current, corporate minutes that named me in the odd little places you put the crucible of authority. A medical power of attorney executed 2 years back. A corporate resolution that, in a paragraph as plain as a country road, allowed the founder or a designated counsel to trigger an emergency governance protocol if the board was incapacitated or compromised. I had not told them about that paragraph. I never had to tell them because I had always planned to. The company was not a toy. It was the livelihood of men who earned their bread driving long hauls in open cabs, who depended on a chain of checks to keep them paid. I could not stand by and let it be stripped for a trust fund. People who think old men are foolish confuse memory for frailty. Memory keeps you vigilant. It keeps the map of who owes what, who is loyal, and who will jump at the first scent of opportunity. I also had a small backup phone wrapped in oilcloth with one number saved under Otto. Otto had been my lawyer through the years, soft-spoken, gray in a manner that suggested he had chosen every fight and then washed his hands of the stains. He knew the bylaws and the emergency protocols better than anyone alive. He also knew how to speak legalese in a way that sounded like the sound of a lock dropping. I pocketed that phone in the leather purse and closed it with more clack than necessary. Marcus III noticed the rosary and tried to joke about old superstitions. Roger kept talking about assisted living like it was an upgrade. Junior, bless him, had the temerity to suggest I didn't know the difference between money and paper anymore. I smiled. I let the smile be small as a hinge. I told them I would pack light. They gave me 1 hour. There are moments when time condenses. You stop counting minutes and start measuring actions. The first 10 minutes I spent in a kind of composure that comes from long practice, sipping coffee, accepting one of Marina's sympathetic smiles when she passed by with the casserole dish, letting Solange fuss about my routine like a mother who has been tasked with a stranger's elder. In the second 10, I went through old letters, a knitting needle someone had given me once at a charity fair, little paintings Gerald had done, landscapes with storms of color he called his weather studies. I slipped the painting of a storm into a tube and tucked it beneath the folder. That painting had the look of a man who had driven rain into the night for the company when contracts evaporated. It was a reminder that storms pass if you hold the wheel steady. They set the clock for 1 hour like a judge. I did not argue. I let them have the ceremonial little triumph, that smug air of men who have decided to choose for you. It revealed more about them than they intended. When the hour was gone, they expected I would be out the door and out of their way. They had already discussed who would take what, who would get the house, who would manage the fleet, who would sort out the books. They had forgotten one old trick, that paperwork is not a relic but a weapon if used for defense. I left a note for the nurses. Routine will call. I kissed the rosary between thumb and forefinger like a man sparing an old friend a farewell. Then I let them see what I wanted them to see. Brokenness. A hand tremble that had more to do with arthritis than fear, an old man's resignation. You can't be loud about your plans when everyone is watching. You must be quieter than the folds of a map. They drove me to Brightwater Care as if it were an errand. Brightwater had the smell of hand soap, an institutional lemon, a magazine rack with back issues of magazines nobody read. The director, Dr. Claudia, met us with a clipboard and a smile that practiced compassion. She had no sense that the smile was a mask for the ease of doing what families asked of them. She believed in forms. Forms make people docile, and doctors like their work to have order. The place looked respectable. Plush chairs, a framed certificate on the wall, excellence in geriatric care, and a small garden out back where a few men from the facility liked to sit and feed the pigeons. A safe place, the brochure said. The word safe is always there in those glossy pamphlets, the way safety sits in front of profit in companies that want to keep both. As they signed me in, as Roger made perfunctory jokes about finally having grandparents, I slipped the leather purse under the cushions of the visiting chair. It was an old habit. To hide what matters in plain sight, under the very thing your opponent thinks will never be checked. I took the pills they offered me, 2 little tablets the nurse set in my palm like candy. I let my fingers close on them and felt the weight of a choice. I did not swallow. Instead, I wrapped them in a tissue and slid them into my pocket. There are simpler ways to be lucid in a facility than being given sedatives as if your opinion were an unnecessary expense. During intake, the facility staff asked routine questions. Medication, allergies, emergency contacts. I said what I had to. I said it with the flatness of a man being read like a ledger. They noted my son's names, their addresses, notes for the file. I heard Roger tell Dr. Claudia too casually that Dad's getting forgetful, and watched the way he said forgetful like a rubric to justify the next steps. Claude smiled and tried to soothe me as if I were a skittish animal. Junior made a joke about the bingo nights. Marcus III tried to be invisible. There are 2 kinds of people in places like that, those who see the old as a burden to be managed, and those who see them as human. Solange was the latter. She found me later, when the room settled and the afternoon light spilled across the knit blanket on my knees. She smelled like the coffee she carried, and always had a look that suggested she had noticed things other people missed. "You look tired, Mr. Gallagher," she said. "Do you need anything?" "Just a good cup of coffee," I told her, "and someone who remembers where a man keeps his paperwork." She laughed, quiet and quick, the kind that moves the corners of a room. "You lot had an hour, Mr. Gallagher. They didn't pack you light." Her eyes asked the only question that mattered. "Do you still have the map?" "I did not," I answered. "Not entirely." We shared a moment of complicity that felt like a small theft against the family drama unfolding down the hall. She brought me coffee and left the door slightly ajar to the corridor. In the sliver of southern light, I made 3 calls. Otto picked up on the second ring, calm as a man who had expected to be called at odd hours his whole professional life. I spoke in measured sentences, no flourish, no wasted warmth. He listened. When I said emergency protocol, he did not ask what I meant. He had drafted it, argued for it, and had it tucked away in a drawer labeled Our Eventuality Plan. He asked for a minute to put the instruments into place. I told him I had exactly 1 window of illusion to keep my family thinking the plan was working. He said, "Do not take any bribes in the form of bottles of Valium." He said it with the dry humor he had always used to keep the room soft. Then he went to work. The other call was simpler. Clint picked up on the first ring, no surprise there. If the company had a single person whose reputation was hammered into the asphalt and diesel of the highways, it was him. Clint had driven for me when I started the company, when we moved from an old Chevy to a second-hand fleet, through strikes and contracts and more late-night loads than either of us cared to count now. He had the voice of a man who'd been listening to radios longer than he used telephones. He asked questions in 2 syllables and lined answers like a yardman lines trailers. "Harold," he said, "you all right?" I told him I was being relocated temporarily. He swore softly, a way that sounded like prayer. "They trying to put you out to pasture?" "More like trying to sell the pasture," I said. I told him to be at the depot at dawn to start a conversation with the drivers. I didn't need a rebellion. I needed a show of solidarity, a demonstration that the men who ran the company, those who actually pulled the loads, knew whose name was on the ledger and who had kept the trucks fed. We chose our words like flags. I did not tell him details. He knew what to do. Move with dignity, call Big Mac at the union, speak to the men as men, not as instruments. A phone conversation with Clint doesn't mobilize an army. It summons a conscience. That was enough. The hour, as promised, turned out to be a courtesy. They left me in the facility's day room with a television playing a matinee quiz show, and Rogers promised to check in later. "We can handle the sale," he said, as if handle were a service one dispensed to other people's lives. They left a stack of paperwork for me to sign later, advance directives, dispensary forms, a document that would make my consent seem like cooperation. I did not sign. If you want to understand the odd power that paperwork can yield, study who writes the rules and who holds the pens. For 50 years, I had been the man who held the pens at the company, who appointed managers, who decided which routes to keep, when to trade in the oldest rigs, how to keep the wallets of drivers from being eaten by uncertainty. I had kept minutes for the sake of clarity, not show, and those minutes had clauses tucked into them, survival clauses for when people forget they owe more than debts. Otto worked quietly. He did not shout or stage dramatics. He drafted letters. He called secure numbers. He arranged for a certified notice to be executed under the clause we had preserved in the bylaws. The emergency brake, as Otto called it, was a procedure that could be triggered when there was sufficient indication of managerial conflict of interest or imminent asset diversion. It required certification, counsel, and the founder's directive. I provided that directive not with a flourish, but with the same care I used when routing a load through an icy pass. The legality was intact. The morality was the point. "And you are certain?" Otto asked. "You want to proceed?" "Do I have a choice?" I asked. "Do the men who drive for me have a choice if the company winds up on the shelves to be auctioned by one of my sons? The men don't love me. They don't have to. They want bread. I'm not willing to let a willful negligence be their last paycheck." He said he would move within the hour and that he would be careful. He also warned, because men like him warn for a living, that the process will be messy and public and that the sons would not take it well. I told him I had endured worse storms and learned to keep the wheel steady. After I hung up, I opened the leather folder again, and took a breath the way you do before climbing into a freight truck at night. You check the manifest twice. You make sure nothing important is loose. There was a night map of the company's routes, annotated by hand in a blue pencil that had belonged to Gerald. There was a letter from a banker that Roger had thought would make a good threat, but which, in truth, was nothing but paper without the chain of custody. I tucked the map into my breast pocket near the rosary. The facility kept a slow rhythm, medication rounds, a therapy class downstairs, the muffled laugh of people working on jigsaw puzzles. It is a rhythm designed to flatten life into manageable beats. I sat inside it and learned to ride those beats like wavelets. I made friends with routine the way a driver befriends the road's shoulder. It keeps you stable when the main lane gets cut off. The first sign of trouble was not at the facility. It was a sound. A convoy of horns far off that had a cadence I'd heard at midnight checkpoints on a different life. It was 3 short, 2 long, an old code the drivers used to announce a convoy's approach. I froze. The sound bloomed across the parking lot like a rumor. Then, through the window, a line of rigs rolled past the entrance like some old parade. Men in reflective vests stood on the lot, leaning against wheels as if forming a fence. They were not a mob. They were a work table, hands, bodies, men who understood the physics of hauling and the dignity of the ledger. Someone pressed a little television remote in my hand, and the news tuned in with the sort of breathless gravity that newsrooms reserve for things that smell like scandal. Gallagher freight operations temporarily suspended, the crawled headline read. Suppliers' invoices citing payment delays scrolled like a bad fortune. I watched my sons' faces reflected in the glass of the television remote as if they were on display in a storefront. I felt no joy in that reflection. I felt the cool satisfaction of a man who had done what he had to do, and the weight of what it would cost. Clint's voice came in my ear again, soft and steady. "They ain't touching the men," he said. "They're just laying down the tracks. Men are pulling in, checking manifest. Big Mac's talking to the drivers. Nobody's getting robbed. Just tell me when, Harold. Tell me when to go full yard." That was the thing about allies. They did not demand scripts. They asked to be given the truth, and in truth there is a kind of rapid obedience. I told him to wait. That was a command of faith. I had to let the legal machinery squeak open before the men who thought they owned everything saw that nothing could be moved without hands and signatures in the right order. Inside the facility, my sons began to see that the old man they had tried to slip away had more bearing on the company than the ledger they hoped to flip. Roger paced and sent terse messages that smelled like panic. Claude, who had always been a peacemaker, looked sideways at his brothers as if trying to find a place to rest the guilt. Marcus III stared into his hands as if trying to see whether his fingers were still the same. Junior called someone and laughed in a way that was too sharp to be pure bravado. They came to visit me the next day in a way that was less triumphant and more uncertain. They wanted signatures. They wanted my consent. They offered me appointments with brokers and the promise of a comfortable arrangement. I looked at them like a man who had been asked to authorize the sale of his own portrait. "You could stay here," Roger said. "It would be safer. We'll visit." He said the last sentence with a syllable that suggested he already had plans to visit like a checkmark. "I appreciate the concern about my safety," I said, "but you should concern yourselves about the safety of the men who drive for the company. They are not a fallback to be traded. They are livelihoods. If the company is mismanaged, they will not be spared by your promises." It was strange to see entitlement suddenly faced with paperwork they could not easily bend. That afternoon, a certified notice arrived at the main office, and the story began to leak the way an oil stain does, slow and definite. Accounts were put on hold not by a hacker in a back room, but by counsel executing a clause that had been written and notarized years before, in better times, when prudence seemed less cynical. Suppliers called the office. Drivers called in. The yardman, Mr. Duke, looked at his clipboard and said the sort of thing men who love their work say when they do not yet have words for strategy. We wait. At Brightwater, I watched the ripples as if I were watching a lake. The day room had been my observatory. A knitting class unfolded under the humming of a fluorescent bulb. An old woman, who knitted the same scarf in different hues for different grandkids, tapped the yarn rhythm like a metronome. A painting with storm clouds hung by the reception desk, the same colors Gerald had used. Life folded in the small things while the engine I had built hiccuped in the distance. There are moments when revenge is not the point, but correction. I told Otto I wanted the sons not humiliated, but required to understand the scaffold that kept the company aloft. I did not want them stripped of dignity. I wanted them to earn it. The law can be a blunt instrument, but if used rightly, it can be a teacher. Otto listened, and then proposed what, in the right hands, looked like a lesson. Place in the boardroom the dossier and the minutes, and make their choices visible. He suggested assigning them roles that required humility, positions where entitlement had to confront labor. He was not cruel, he was practical, which is a different word for mercy. I had some pride in asking for this. I did not relish the idea of sending my sons back into the sweat of the yard, but I did relish the thought that a man could reclaim his name without bulldozing the future of those who worked beside him. I kept thinking of the drivers, of Clint's steady face illuminated by the early light in the yard, of men who had called me boss with a mix of respect and affection that is not often preserved in families. When the sons finally came to the Brightwater garden to check on me, they found a different kind of visitor. Big Mac had taken the phone calls, and after a brief conference that involved no threats and a lot of blunt truth, had arranged for a delegation of drivers to come by and speak to the board. They were not there to make spectacle. They carried manifest lists and union cards and the kind of deportment men have when they know what to lose and what they must protect. The first horn sounded like a reminder. It was 3 short, 2 long, and when it came over the lot, I felt the same thing I felt on the day we signed the first loan for the company 50 years ago. Society will at times fail you. Your responsibility is to show up. The rig that pulled up was old, with a dent in the fender and a story in every rib. Clint stepped down and tipped his cap. "Mr. Gallagher," he said with the simplicity of a man who knows what courtesy costs and thinks it worth paying. "We came to make sure what's right stays right." That day, in a room that smelled of disinfectant and old coffee, my sons first saw that there are limits to what paper can command when men are willing to hold the line. They could not order men to drive for promises. They had to face the ledger of neglected payrolls and missed maintenance and contracts signed in haste. It was not instant justice. It was slow and public and painful. Back in my room, as the evening sun slanted through the curtain slats and painted my hands in bars of gold, I felt the operation beginning to breathe. Otto's voice came across once more. "We've executed the emergency governance clause. The council has notified the board. Supply lines will see a pause while we audit and secure transactions. It will be messy, Harold." "I am aware," I said. "Be precise." "Always," he answered. "Lawyers are like cooks. They can make a fortress from a recipe if you let them." I slept badly that night, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of a man who knows his fate is now a public narrative. At dawn the next morning, the phones began to ring at the office. I watched on the television through a small window in the day room as messages crawled. Operations hold, corporate counsel engaged. The sons' faces on my television were less certain than they'd been in my living room. I felt no triumph. I felt the clean, hard tang of responsibility. At mid-morning, a nurse came by with a paper bag and a cup. "The family wants to know if you'd like a visit," she said. I looked at her, and then at the window where the rigs sat like a parade of judgment in the yard. "Tell them yes," I said, "and tell them to bring work gloves." That afternoon, they arrived in fits and starts. Roger, with his pressed suit and a voice made for press releases. Claude, carrying an expression like a man who had decided to try fairness for the first time. Marcus III, who looked as if he had slept badly and had been woken to the kind of responsibility that frightens addicts into clarity. Junior, who brought perfume and a watch he had not earned. They asked questions. They demanded explanations. They wanted to know the names of the men at the barrier. They wanted to know how a coup like what they had planned could be intercepted by a clause they had never read. I answered them the way a man answers when he is an elder and a steward, plainly, with the kind of economy of words that is the only accompaniment to truth. You gave me 1 hour, I reminded them, because memory is a corrective, and the past has a funny way of filling the mouth with things people intend to forget. You should have gone, Roger said. I did go, I said. I went to the place you thought would keep me quiet. That's where I found friends who remember what a ledger means and friends who will not be sold without hearing the truth. They realized then that they had miscalculated. They had expected my silence. They had not expected that I had used their hour to prepare. Their grief looked like anger, and their anger looked like fear. That fear is an honest thing. It strips polish from the soul. As the sun slid down behind the yard that evening, I listened to a series of messages that told me that suppliers were calling, that some contracts were held up for now, that men had been asked to wait on the yard, and that Big Mac had requested a meeting with council. It was messy, it was public, it was necessary, it was, most of all, true. I closed my eyes and thought of Gerald, and the way he used to say that a man's name is a responsibility handed down like a key. Don't be extravagant with it, he had once told me, slapping a palm on the hood of an old truck and laughing like a man who had swallowed storm and survived. I felt his laughter in the painting I'd carried in my bag, the one with the storm that now seemed less like disaster and more like something to navigate. That night, as the facility settled into its muffled rotors, the clink of a cup, the rustle of a newspaper, I took out the leather folder again and read. There are pages in life that require patience. You cannot fix a company with a single gesture. You can, however, stop it being looted from within. You can ensure the men who keep the wheels moving are not trampled under some spoiled plan. Otto had told me the action would bring attention. I was not naive. Attention is a kind of weather. I was more concerned about consequence. The sons would respond. Families do. They might go to court. They might call reporters. They might even, in a fit of hubris, try to outmaneuver the legal instruments I had used. But paper is not just paper when it is signed, sealed, and witnessed. It is a series of small truths that accumulate into a barricade. I placed my hand over the rosary and felt the smoothness of the beads under my thumb. The rosary had accompanied me through more than prayer. It had been a way to count things that mattered. Names of routes, lists of friends, the syllables of promises. I thought of the drivers who had come to the yard to stand like the teeth of a comb facing the wind. I thought of Clint's face as he had stepped down from the rig, cap in hand, and how the men answered him with the kind of respect that doesn't need a chairman to prescribe it. It is a peculiar comfort at this age to know you are still needed. I had built a company from a handshake and a lane of blacktop. I had been careless in some measures. Pride makes men careless, but mostly I had been faithful. Faithful enough that men would recognize what it meant when I stepped up to defend them. The next morning, when Roger stormed back into Brightwater with a stack of lawyers and a glare like a thunderhead, I realized the real work had only begun. The son he had thought complicit in the scheme now stood defenseless against paperwork he had used as a prop. He had assumed the ledger would bow to his new vision of convenience. He had not counted on the men of the road, the union, and the council that stood between a willful strip and a lawful preserving of the company. Roger's temper was a kind of sound that used to make people obey him. It did not work this time. He tried to intimidate the nurse at the desk. He barked into a phone. He called me names he had learned to use when he was angry and bored. I simply told him to come into the garden and look out at the yard. He did. He saw the rigs and the men leaning on them like an old set of bones. He saw the manifest clipped to a clipboard and the name Clint written in a hand that did not flatter. He saw the faces of men whose livelihood he had thought to sell. There is a lesson in that sight. Authority is different from ownership. Ownership can be a ledger line. Authority is what the men grant you. I had it, not because I had held title the longest, but because I'd kept faith when it mattered. My sons had title on paper. Authority is earned by walking the rain. Roger wanted me to yield. He wanted the signatures that would make his deal clean. I told him I would yield to nothing that endangered the men. He grew loud. Claude stepped forward and said in a small voice, "Maybe there's a way we can work this out." It was the first sentence from him that I had considered brave in years. I let them argue. That is part of the theater of family. You let them perform their bravado because each act reveals a crack. I listened for the cracks. The cracked places are where you can insert truth. By the time the sun had slid and the yard had begun to empty, drivers going home to families, engines cooling under the polite blur of twilight, the situation had settled into a precarious lull. Otto had filed notices. The company servers were flagged for audit. Big Mac had agreed to supervise payroll continuity with council to ensure no driver went unpaid because of a personal squabble. It was a slow, legal coup in the name of preservation. I lay back in the dayroom chair and watched a woman at the knitting table stitch the same row over and over. Her hands were steady. She looked up at me and said, "Young blood always thinks they can redraw the lines." "Young blood is loud," I said, "but lines are not redrawn by noise." I let the room keep its small rituals. I let the knitting clamp the noise into neat rows. The phone in my pocket vibrated. It was Clint. "They're talking about an early convoy," he said, "but we've held the men." He did not ask what I wanted. He informed me. That is the sign of a good ally. "Tell them to stand by," I said. "No moves until council says the yard can move." "Always steady, boss," he said, a habit of respect and joke. He knew I would be called boss, in a way I had not been in years. It sat on me like a coat that fit again. As night fell and the facility hummed, I realized I had used their hour not to retreat, but to prepare. I had used the small kindness of Solange, the legal mind of Otto, and the old loyalty of Clint to make a defense. It was not revenge. It was preservation. I do not relish conflict. I have always preferred a good negotiation at a kitchen table with coffee and the respectful clink of ceramic. But there are times when the ledger and the lives attached to it require a firmer hand than comforting words. My sons would have to learn something that cannot be taught by reading a finance manual. They would have to learn it on their hands. They would not like it. And I am not sure they are ready. Yet, outside, the rigs lay like a circle of patient teeth. Inside, the facility clock kept time with my father's Waltham. I felt the old pulse of the company in my wrist. I felt, too, the ache of age. But between the ache and the pulse, there is a space where choice is still possible. At midnight, I wrote a note to Claude. I told him to come by the office in the morning and to bring a pair of work gloves. I set the leather folder on the nightstand where the lamp made a small island of light. I said a prayer, quiet, private, thanking the sorts of things one thanks at 74. The loyalty of men, the stubbornness of an old heart, and the fact that 1 hour had become a test that perhaps could be turned into something better than a tidy betrayal. There are no easy victories in this life, but there are chances to set things right. I do not imagine my sons will find these chances comfortable. Good. Comfort breeds bad habits. Pain is a better teacher than privilege. In the morning I will walk back into the yard not as a defeated man, but as one who has chosen to stand. The men who built the company with me will be there. Otto will be drafting reports. Clint will be keeping an eye on the road. The sons will come with their suits and their lawyers and their plans. They gave me 1 hour to pack. I used it to gather what I needed. Now it is time to see whether the company will be defended by law, by loyalty, or by the shallow illusions of inheritance. The storm had broken, and now the work of clearing the road would begin. Morning arrived like a verdict, pale, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. When I stepped into the yard that day, the world smelled of diesel and damp concrete, smells that still feel like belonging to me. The rigs were lined up like old soldiers, their chrome catching the low sun. Clint stood by the cab of the oldest rig, hands on hips, the same silhouette he'd cut when we'd unloaded trailers in the rain years ago. Otto was at his side, briefcase closed, face the color of someone who'd stayed up reading statutes and still managed to look like a man who had slept. The sons pulled in like a cluster of threatened peacocks, each man trying to arrange his outrage in a color that matched a suit. Roger's tie had the kind of sheen that says, "Press release." Claude's face carried that hesitant steadiness he'd always had. Less armor, more honesty. Marcus III looked like a man who'd been reading the wrong books. The sleep under his eyes had the late stamp of desperation. Junior arrived late, of course, as if the concept of schedule were a suggestion. They showed up with lawyers. That had been predictable. They demanded a meeting. I told Otto I preferred the yard over the boardroom. The yard is where truth smells like grease, not rhetoric. We met at the mahogany table in the office because legally, the boardroom is where orders and obligations are certified. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old leather. I placed the leather folder, the one they'd watched me tuck away like treasure, on the table. I let it make the sound I remembered it making when Gerald and I used to close deals. A soft, deliberate clap. "You're still a free man, Dad," Roger started. His voice had the tightness of a man who had rehearsed indignation into a performance. "We have every right. You have rights," I interrupted, measured and dry. "You also have responsibilities. Rights without responsibility where I come from is not management, it's malpractice." Otto spoke in the way lawyers speak when they're setting the frame, not loud but immovable. He outlined what had been done, Council's certified notice, the governance protocol triggered on the grounds of apparent conflict, the appointment of a temporary oversight committee that would ensure continuity while a forensic audit examined recent transactions. I let those words land like oaths. They had to be heavy enough to be real. The point was not spectacle but stability. "This isn't a witch hunt," Otto said. "It's a preservation. The fund is in legal freeze only to the extent necessary to secure payrolls and payables for the drivers and to prevent dissipation pending audit." Roger's mouth made a valve of indignation. "You would take my signature away, you would—" "I took your silence away," I said. "You had an hour to pack. You used it to conspire. You signed nothing because you knew nothing worth signing. That ends now." He bristled. Claude shifted, and for a moment I thought he might speak for reason. Marcus III's lawyer hunched like a man trying to make his client's life smaller than it was. Junior fiddled with a watch he'd bought with other people's promises. I watched them like a man who had read the ledger and finally opened the accounts to show the debits that mattered. Otto then proposed what would become the core of our restitution plan, a conditional remediation program for any family member still on the payroll or with vesting interest. In plain English, if you wanted to hold title, you had to prove you could hold responsibility. The terms were legal, binding, and framed as an alternative to permanent exclusion. It was not designed to be vindictive. It was designed to be instructive. "We're not punishing you," Otto said to the sons, eyes steady on each in turn. "We're offering a course of restoration that puts you where the problems were created, in operations. If you can do the work, honor contracts, and submit to oversight, the board will consider reinstating certain privileges. If you cannot, the board must act to protect the livelihood of hundreds." There was a silence like the pause before a heavy gear drops. I watched the color drain from music room Roger. For a man who sold futures like they were pieces of lawn furniture, being asked to record manifests and check the air in a tire was a humiliation in his ledger. Claude, who'd been a good man in a way that doesn't show on income statements, recognized the fairness in it and exhaled as if relief had arrived like rain. Marcus III's eyes slid to me like a man seeking scaffolding. Junior's jaw tightened as if determination might be manufactured on demand. "I won't be bullied," Roger said. He tried to make a show of leaving the room entirely, with lawyers blocking any immediate shove back. The company's secretary read out the conditions Otto had drafted. Probationary roles supervised by Mr. Duke and union representatives, a 3-month probation with measurable KPIs, mandatory attendance in remedial operational training, and immediate removal from any financial signatory lists until the audit cleared them. Big Mac would oversee payroll continuity. Otto and an independent auditor would manage finances. The sons could accept these terms or contest them in court, a right no one denied, but the board's priority was continuity, not revenge. My voice was quieter than it had been in the living room. "You gave me an hour to pack," I said, feeling that phrase like a hinge. "And you packed the assumptions. You mistook my age for absence. I was gone an hour and found more clarity." Roger looked like he might burn a hole in end of the table with his gaze. "This is extortion," he spat. "It is accountability," I answered. "And if you want to preserve what our family built, you will take your hands off the ledger and put them back on the work. Let the men teach you. Let the yard humble you. If you endure that without cutting the ropes, you might keep your place. If you try to bully your way back, don't make threats, Harold," he warned. "I'm not threatening," I said. "I'm stipulating." After tense negotiations, legal rhetoric softened by the obvious public interest, Roger agreed to the probationary terms with all his teeth clenched. Claude, by contrast, seemed to accept with quiet apology in the way only peacemakers do, ready to repair. Marcus III, picking the last of the easy fights from his mouth, took the mechanic's apprenticeship with Marcus's lawyer, grumbling but present. Junior, chastened more by the sight of men at the yard than by any legal clause, accepted the role of delivery assistant. The sons had a choice: keep polishing abstract visions of what they deserved, or earn a seat in the operations they had been trying to sell. Big Mac's presence mattered more than his words. He nodded at the terms as though approval was a done thing. The drivers wanted continuity, not spectacle. They wanted the men who had always stood behind the wheel to keep standing. They wanted payroll. They wanted a boss who understood diesel as much as dividends. The drivers weren't there for drama. They were there for bread. That steadied the room. We walked the yard. Mr. Duke showed Claude where files were kept and what a manifest required. He showed Marcus III how to check a piston and the meaning of torque beyond coffee talk. He showed Junior how to secure a load. Clint taught Roger how to watch the yard like a man who understood that a yard is not a line on a balance sheet, but a geography of responsibility. Parking, maintenance, schedules. The sons fumbled at first. Their hands moved like men in another language learning verbs. My own heart ached watching Roger wrestle with the clipboard. He had once negotiated routes worth more than this yard's value. Now he was trying to learn how to secure a strap properly. The sight was not joyous. It was necessary. Pride being shaved away is an awkward process. Consider it a surgical correction rather than punishment. The audit took longer than any of us wanted. Forensic accountants like to peel back layers. They have the patience of surgeons and the appetite of historians. Otto moved with his usual steadiness, documents, subpoenas where warranted, and the constant reassurance that what we sought was truth, not vengeance. Some transactions from recent months were questionable, contracts signed without necessary approval, unusual wire transfers, invoices that didn't align. The audit made subtle, ugly truths legible. It also made possible a range of measured remedies: restitution where possible, renegotiation where necessary, and structural changes to ensure unilateral decisions couldn't be made again. News outlets, smelling conflict, started to circle. But we were careful. Otto insisted on measured statements. The company's actions were to protect employees and ensure fiscal integrity, nothing more. Big Mac and the union made sure the drivers were paid during the freeze by coordinating a payroll bridge funded by escrow arrangements. None of the men felt abandoned. The public saw trucks in the yard, drivers standing with union cards, and a founder who had refused to be written off. Some called it a family tragedy. Others called it old-fashioned stubbornness put to good use. Inside the company, the sons found themselves graded on practicalities they had never considered. Roger, assigned as interim yard manager under Mr. Duke's supervision, had to manage dock rotations and equipment logs. The first morning he took the clipboard, a rig pulled in with a trailer that had been loaded improperly. The driver looked at him like a man who'd been sold a claim and wanted the truth. Roger barked orders he didn't quite own. Mr. Duke corrected him with a grunt and a show of muscle memory. "You check the twist locks first," Mr. Duke said, voice iron soft. "If you don't, you lose a trailer and you'll lose a load. The company doesn't pay you for being pretty, it pays you for being useful." Roger swallowed pride and checked the locks. He then found himself helping an older driver break a stuck chain. For the first time in years, he got grease under his nails. He didn't like it. He did it anyway. There is a peculiar humility that comes from doing what you once thought beneath you. It is a hard teacher. Claude's work in the records room was quieter. He learned to reconcile deliveries to invoices, to read contracts not as tools for leverage, but as promises to be kept. He found an unexpected ease in the order. The slow, methodical work steadied something in him. Marcus III, under Mr. Duke's aegis, scrubbed engines and learned the cadence of tools. He stumbled, he exhausted himself, he sweated. The physicality was a grimmer catechism than any program a counselor could have assigned. But he also laughed once when the old piston finally came free and a man clapped him on the back like a teammate. That laugh sounded like light through a cracked pane. Junior delivered packages under the eye of a driver named Hank, who had the patience of a man who'd learned that people are more important than schedules. Hank taught him to fold a bill of lading with care and to ask a recipient to check a seal before the truck door closes. Junior's first route was a disaster of missed turns and a fumbled scanner, but the man whose groceries he'd delivered to that day wrote the name of the company with a tone of appreciation when Junior apologized and left his phone number. Small acts of service softened stubborn metal. At Brightwater, Dr. Claudia watched the unfoldings with a complicated face. She had arrived to us with the best of intentions professionally, but the ease with which families can offload obligations had blinded her to the emotional calculus of elder agency. She apologized quietly on a bench in the garden. "I should have asked more questions," she told me, voice low. "I believed the sons and the papers they presented. I didn't look for the man in the room." "You looked at the forms," I said. "Forms are helpful. People who are hurting need to be seen, not shunted. You kept the standards of your profession. You missed the standard of mercy in action." She nodded, a small concession. "How do we fix it?" "We keep asking better questions," I said. "We treat people like people." She began to make small changes in the intake process and to include an advocacy channel for residents who weren't represented by family. It wasn't grand. It was right. The weeks that followed were not cinematic. They were small and stubborn. The forensic audit produced a list of discrepancies that required remedial action. Funds misapplied, contracts signed without proper board assent, and a series of rushed sales pitches that had patched immediate gaps while creating long-term exposure. Legal remedies took the form of restitution where money could be traced, rescission of certain dubious signing authorities, and tighter corporate governance moving forward. Otto and the auditor negotiated, litigated when necessary, and oversaw corrective measures. If there was a moral to this, it was that paperwork misused is a slow poison. It takes a patient hand to cleanse it. The son's faces shifted over those months. It wasn't instantaneous, it was a remolding. Roger learned that being in charge sometimes meant being present in the mud. He learned to take a call from a driver about a delayed payment and to stay on the line until the solution was found. He learned to ask for help from Clint and to accept it. Claude found a rhythm in reconciling ledgers and had, to my quiet amusement, become keen on minutes. He'd learned to call them truth sheets and spoke of them like a man finding solace in order. Marcus III began attending an evening program offered by Big Mac and the union that combined trade training and counseling. He was clumsy and sincere, and sometimes sloppy and sometimes luminous. Junior discovered the dignity of service. He told me once, eyes red with the effort of honesty, that he had never felt so tired and so good. None of them were transformed into saints. I would never ask that of a man. Transformation is messy and incremental. But the company that came out of the crisis was cleaner and, crucially, less subject to the whim of a single spoiled vision. We instituted new governance, an oversight council with union representation, mandatory quarterly audits, checks on single signatory powers, and a restored emphasis on maintenance and driver welfare. The men who drove the routes had a voice in matters that affected their lives. That was the point. There were moments of friction. At a meeting one afternoon, Roger bristled when I suggested a change in route allocation to reduce overwork. "We can't just reorganize because someone takes offense," he argued. "This isn't about offense," I said. "It's about sustainability. If a driver runs himself into the ground, he doesn't earn anything because he can't work. We protect our men because they are the company. That's not softness. That's stewardship." He listened. He argued. He adapted. Concessions were not given like trophies. They were earned like respect. Outside, Clint kept to his steady rhythm. He would drop by the facility with a thermos of coffee and a report or two. "They need good coffee when they fight the ledgers," he'd say, smiling at the knitting group in the day room. The drivers, those invisible men who keep a world moving, sent notes and lunches. When the first payroll after the audit cleared was disbursed, men gathered like a weekend chapel, simple, grateful, and precise. One of them, a fellow named Ramon, who'd been with the company longer than Roger had been alive, pressed my hand and muttered, "Boss, you kept the road honest." I did not feel like a boss. I felt like someone who'd chosen a long-ago promise and had to stand by it. Promises have weight. They sink into the ground and then into the habits of people. If you are lucky, they root you. There was a day when the sons had to perform publicly to show they could do the work. A community day at the depot had drivers, families, and the press under a blue sky. Marcus III, holding a wrench with a hand that shook at first, leaned into the job and then straightened with a grin when the engine roared back to life. Junior, sweaty and red-faced, delivered a local farmer's load and returned with a handshake and the farmer's gratitude. Claude had a table with records open and answered questions about payroll like a man who had found a language he could own. Roger stood in the background at first. Then he stepped up to a microphone and spoke plainly. No press release, just a man who'd learned the cost of a promise. He apologized, not in ceremonies but in particulars, to the drivers for the scares, to the families for the uncertainty, and quietly, to me for his haste. That apology was not a surrender. It was a repair. It cost him something, and therefore it was worth something. That evening, I sat alone in the same chair in the day room where I'd watched knitting loops become scarves. The painting with its storm, Gerald's storm, hung across the room. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Claude. He handed me a folded pair of work gloves, clean but with the faint scent of oil. "For you," he said. You said you'd want to see your sons learn to work. I took the gloves and felt the roughness of the cloth. Not a bad gift, I said. You've done well. He sat and, more softly, asked me what I had intended when I made the company in the first place. I told him the simple litany of a man who builds: give men work, keep them paid, and do not sell the future for quick profit. He nodded as if those tenets were fresh lessons. He'd learned them slow and hard. The legal actions were wrapped up in their own way. Some money was returned. Some contracts were rescinded and renegotiated on fairer terms. The audit recommended more transparency, and the board approved structural changes that choked off the possibility of a repeat. Otto had done his work with that tight, necessary style that makes the law less like a club and more like a brace. He and I had a quiet conversation one afternoon where he reminded me that our actions had to be defensible not only in court, but in conscience. You could have made it about more, he said. You chose not to. It's not about me, I said. It's about the men who can't feed their children because some quick hands wanted an easy harvest. Gradually, life settled into a new rhythm. The company ran, the men were paid, and the sons continued to show up at the yard. Their faces were less polished, more real. They came to me sometimes to ask for advice on a spreadsheet, or to tell me a driver had noticed a problem they'd overlooked. They did the work, and the unglamorous discipline of it began to change them from the inside. There were moments of tenderness that surprised me. One afternoon, Marcus III walked into the office with a canvas under his arm. He had always had Gerald's eye for color, an inherited trait, and this canvas was rough but luminous. He placed it on my desk without a flourish. I tried to paint the yard, he said, voice thin with effort. It looks like a storm, but it looks honest. I looked at it and saw not an artist, but a man who'd found something true. I reached for the rosary in my breast pocket and touched it, feeling the familiar bead. It looks like a road, I said. Junior came by more often now, mostly to bring coffee. He'd lost the sharp edges of easy confidence. One evening he surprised me by showing up with a small packet. Inside was a folded note he'd written, awkward, earnest, thanking me for making him sweat and for not letting him off the hook. He'd found work in the simple dignity of having done the work. Dr. Claudia visited with a report of her own. A policy handbook for Brightwater intake that emphasized resident autonomy and required a third-party advocate for any expedited transfer to a facility at the family's insistence. We need to protect people from their families sometimes, she told me, voice small. You need to protect them from systems that assume formality equals consent, I said. She laughed, and then we both fell quiet. Two old people who'd learned the weight of being seen. The company's profits, models won't love this as a fairy tale, stabilized slowly. Honest labor tends to produce steady returns, not gold-plated windfalls. We reopened some routes that had been let lapse and tightened maintenance so that we lost fewer breakdowns. The men I had worried about had paychecks in the bank and dignity in their hands. That, to me, was justice enough. There were also private reparation moments. One night, when the moon had silvered the yard and the rigs looked like sleeping beasts, Roger came to the office and closed the door behind him. He did not bring lawyers. He brought a small box with tools. He'd bought them himself, and a letter of apology he had written in a hand that looked like work. I cannot undo what I tried, he said, but I can do what I should have done first. I want to learn. We sat at the table, and in a low way I forgave him. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's an agreement to stop trading barbs and start trading responsibilities. I made him a deal. Keep showing up, keep the books honest, and he could rebuild his trust. He wept like a man who'd been taught to swallow feelings and had finally decided to spit them back out as truth. As the months passed, The painting of Gerald's storm hung in my den at home. It was a reminder of the weather we'd passed through. I took knitting from time to time, the rhythm a salve for nights when the ledger called up like a phantom. The rosary beads sat beside my glass of water. Sometimes I held them and counted the men who'd stood in the yard for us and thought of names I would keep. The sun's transformations were incomplete and ongoing. Marcus III still had his moments of temptation. He went to meetings and sometimes stumbled, but he also learned to repair a carburetor and the modest pride that came with it. Junior still had the occasional flare of vanity, but the gratitude he'd received from people he'd delivered to had softened him. Claude became a meticulous keeper of minutes. His peacekeeping had become a craft of accountability. Roger, the oldest, was the slowest to change and the most important. He had learned the most painful lesson, that titles without trade are fragile. One afternoon, not long after the crisis ended, Roger brought the family over to Brightwater, not as intruders, but as visitors. He walked into the garden and, with surprising humility, thanked the nurses and the staff. He lingered with Solange, whose quiet acts of kindness I'd seen tug at the threads of the day, and he thanked her for noticing me. She laughed in that quick way she always did, and then pointed at the rosary I kept in my pocket. "You kept your man," she said. "That's what matters." The day came when the board lifted the special governance hold, conditioned on continued oversight and the reforms we'd put into place. The company was not the same as it had been before. We'd been forced into a healthier shape. That was the reward of pain. We could have kept my sons out, expelled them like bad tenants. We chose instead to require labor and contrition. That, I decided, is a kinder kind of justice. It mends rather than maims. At home that night, after the board meeting, the house smelled like pot roast again. The lace tablecloth had been ironed and folded. It was no longer an accusation but a marker of continuity. I took Gerald's storm painting down and leaned it in the hallway where the light would hit it sometimes. I sat in the chair and opened the leather folder one last time. Papers orderly, minutes logged, the map tucked where it belonged. There is an odd peace that comes from being proved necessary. It is humbling and sweet. I thought of the men at the yard and felt gratitude like a warm bruise. I thought of my sons and felt a complicated mix of pride and guardian sorrow. They had made mistakes big enough to topple livelihoods. They had been given a chance to rebuild them. That redemption is messy and provisional, but it is real. The knitting needles that sat in a jar on the mantel clinked when I reached for them. They were not for show. I found solace in the small motions. My hand passed over the rosary, and I felt the beads smooth beneath my thumb, each one a small promise kept. I thought of things my father had said, simple truths about stewardship and stubbornness and the dignity of work. They had been right. The road is a teacher with a cold, honest voice. On the porch as twilight fell, Clint pulled up in his rig and hopped down with a thermos and a grin. "Road's clear for you tonight?" he asked, with that old rough tenderness. "For now," I said. He laughed. "That's enough." We sipped terrible coffee and watched as the trucks eased into night routes, men moving like the older parts of the world that still make sense when the markets wobble. Clint clapped me on the shoulder. "You taught 'em right," he said. "Took 'em hard, but they'll remember better." I nodded. "I hope they remember mercy as well as hammer." He looked at me, and with all the simplicity of a man who measures worth by miles, said, "You did the right thing, boss, even when it was ugly. There are nights when I wake and the house is too big." I walk to the window and watch the moon over the yard where my life is parked. The rigs are often gone, but their absence feels like the same quiet you get after a long symphony. The echo of something that mattered. The sons come by now without the sharpness of entitlement. They come bearing small repairs and sometimes a tin of cookies from someone they've delivered to. They have learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, to be useful. We still argue. The board still meets. There are late nights of wrangling over contracts and occasionally a letter that makes you frown, but the foundation holds. Men with hands who will not be cheated, a governance that cannot be bent by family dramas, and a father who will not be moved from the center of what he built. One evening, as I sat in my armchair with the painting across from me and the rosary in the palm of my hand, I thought about the hour they had given me to pack. It had been an hour meant to exile me. It had become a liminal hour, a test that revealed not only their designs, but my own refusal to be made small. What I did with that hour was less about trickery and more about stewardship. I used it to gather instruments and allies, and to remind people that work and responsibility are the currencies that keep communities alive. There was no triumphant trumpet. There was no dance of humiliation for my sons. There were long afternoons of instruction, nights of paperwork, and the slow, honest recompense of men who took up shovels. That, in the end, was my answer to being given 1 hour to pack. I packed responsibility into their daily lives, their tools, and their hours. Now, when I walk through the yard, men call me by a name that's half affection, half habit. The sons stand next to them as colleagues, not autocrats. The company hums, not with the currency of quick gains, but with something steadier. The sound of engines maintained, manifest checked, and paychecks that arrive. Legacy, I've found, is not a box you pass along. It's a stewardship you keep and return. If this kind of comeback inspired you, tap like and share it with someone who believes in second chances. And if you've ever been asked to pack in an hour, by family, by fate, by circumstance, tell me in the comments, what would you have taken with you? If there's one thing I'd pass on, it is this. Dignity is not the absence of struggle. It is the choice to stand steady through it. Disclaimer. These stories are made up, created for dramatic purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons or events is accidental. Subscribe now to Peter Stories YT and join a community that values powerful stories, deep emotions, and life lessons that truly matter.